Shall we start? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Can you hear me?
We're going to be recording this. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, it's probably going to go on the website and on the Facebook page at least anyway, sorry. Feel free to just not have the video play of you. And if anybody objects to that, then we hope not. We just want to have a recording of this. Okay, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Nadia. I'm from BDS Australia, one of the co-hosts for this evening. Nick Reimer from Sydney staff for BDS, who will guide the discussion, is the other co-host, who we already have been speaking to. First, I'd like to do an acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge this land that we are on, and like Palestine, that sovereignty was never ceded. I acknowledge the continued resistance of our First Nations and that of the Palestinians to the ongoing process of colonisation that seeks to deny, define and determine our reality. Despite the pain and trauma, our elders persisted in instilling in us an identity beyond one that the coloniser has bestowed upon us, and that our connection to our lands are unbroken, deep and rooted. I, a Palestinian, a daughter of survivors of the Nakba, stand firm with my Indigenous brothers and sisters in their pursuit of decolonisation and land rights. This land was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Tonight, we will be talking to Palestinian academic Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh about the current challenges for Palestinians as we commemorate 72 years since the Nakba of 1948. When 90% of Palestinians were driven out by psychological warfare or at gunpoint and through widespread massacres. 500 plus Palestinian villages were literally destroyed overnight. However, the Nakba is not a historical trauma, nor just one point in time, but is an ongoing event. Everyday Palestinians are shelled, executed, arrested, taken to prison, arbitrarily detained, families separated, denied the freedom of movement, particularly after the construction of the separation wall, now deemed illegal under international law, which has also largely undermined livelihoods. Palestinians are also subject to ongoing land appropriations and home demolitions, are humiliated at checkpoints. Minors are arrested, detained, shot, jailed, executed, and tortured. Palestinians continuously experience the usurpation of their water and their natural resources, denied access to education, employment, subject to settler violence, and lack any access to any source of justice that would protect their rights. For those in refugee camps in surrounding countries, Palestinians and elsewhere in the diaspora are denied the right of return enshrined under international law, but denied to them by Israel. Today, there are over 7 million Palestinian refugees. One of the ways in which we can be proactive in the struggle to end the ongoing violations against the Palestinians is through targeted boycotts called for by Palestinian civil society. Our current BDS campaigns include Boycott Israeli Dates. We posted on Facebook a list of Israeli brands to avoid. Please go to the Facebook page for details, but ultimately just check the labels. Boycott HP. HP supplies the Israeli state with technology, equipment, and information used in its ongoing violations of Palestinians' rights and international law. Check out our website to find out more and take a moment to take our pledge. Don't buy HB products. Also, the Boycott Puma campaign. Puma are sponsoring a football team from an illegal Israeli settlement. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram to keep up to date with the campaigns and other actions as they are required. The BDS movement is only as strong as the people behind it who participate and engage in the campaigns. BDS Australia are also always looking for people to get involved, so please reach out through the Facebook page or through the website via the Contact Us option. Also, while you're at the website, please think about making a donation to support and expand the work. The BDS Australia website is www bdsaustralia.net.au. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Nadia. Hi, everyone. So my name's Nick Reamer, and I'm from the Sydney University Staff BDS Group, which is a group of academic and professional staff at the University of Sydney who are committed to campaigning for our university to join the academic boycott of Israeli academic institutions, and we're the co-host for tonight's event. It's a real privilege tonight to have Mazin Qumsiyeh with us. Mazin is director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History. He's a professor at Bethlehem and Birzeit Universities, and he's also a long-time activist for justice in Palestine-Israel. He's going to detail the current political and humanitarian situation in the occupied West Bank and Gaza for us, which of course are under the twin threats at the moment of both the coronavirus and a looming Israeli annexation. After Mazin's talk, there will be a question period. So I encourage you to think of questions, and if you have any, when the question period starts, but not before, please place them in the chat window. If you put them there before, it'll just be too hard for me to keep track of them. Mazin is the author of more than 140 academic papers, including one I think just published this week. You told me, Mazin, about the hyena that you had been looking after at the Palestine Museum of Natural History, who I saw in December, actually. But he's also an authority on the politics of Palestinian resistance, and I particularly note his 2004 book, Sharing the Land of Canaan, Human Rights and the Israeli-Palestinian Struggle, and his 2011 book, Popular Resistance in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment, published by Pluto Press as well in 2011. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Mazin. Mazin, thanks very much for being with us, and I'll also share my screen so that we can all see your PowerPoint. When you want to move on to the next slide, Mazin, please just tell me. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Please take it away, Mazin.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it for having me speak. And we have more than 60 people now who joined this call, so that's great to see there's an interest. Yes, I'm speaking to you from Bethlehem, of course. This is where Jesus was born according to our Christian traditions. And it's a city like many Palestinian cities that are under siege with very difficult circumstances. But also we are speaking at the anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people. And the catastrophe is not an event in a particular day, it's actually an ongoing Nakba. And so I will speak a little bit about that. But let me go through, next slide, please. Just to put things in context, we are in this part of the world, it's a center of even bird migrations between Europe and Africa. Eurasia and Africa, basically. It's a very important geographic location for animals, for plants, and for humans. Even us humans migrated out of Africa to the rest of the world through Palestine. So all of you on this call are actually Palestinian by definition, because your ancestors had passed through Palestine, lived here for a while, and then some of us decided to continue to the rest of the world. Next slide. You know, the United Nations had set some goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we humans have to watch over, to have a clean air, you know, zero hunger, etc. These were lofty goals, and we are falling far short on all of these goals, especially in things like climate change and so forth. We have bigger fish to fry, so to speak, than the issue of Palestine. We have much more global threats, which you are familiar with. Yeah, go ahead, the next slide. Now, when you look at normal statistical parameters like what they show us, the World Bank and others show us, they show that the world GDP in the last 2 millennium continue to grow. And of course, plastic production and fuel consumption, all of these things continue to grow. Human population continues to grow. Now we are 7.5 billion people. Next slide. And if you look at poverty, you know, some people say, well, we're doing fine, you know, poverty is declining, although in some regions of the world it's worse than others. Sub-Saharan Africa, as you know, poverty rates are still hovering between 40 and 50% of the population. The world itself, poverty has declined from 35% to less than 20% now. So people can say, hey, you know, it's good news. Next slide. If we look, for example, at the percent of the population that's poor, you know, in rural areas, urban areas, you know, in other countries, we have a decline in percent of people who are poor. Next. However, the problem is that this is kind of a general trend, but it does not help when you look at inequality. Inequality has been rising. Actually, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And I don't need to give you this data. You are already familiar with it from any country you visit, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, whatever. You will see that the percentage of wealth that's held by the richest people is certainly increasing at the expense of the poor people. Next slide. If we look at income and you know, reductions in inequality, I don't want to make this an economic lecture. I'm not an economist or anything, but I think, you know, my point in all of this is that the inequality in the people, among the people, is getting higher. The income reduction in inequality is very limited around the world. In some countries, better than others, of course. But there is certainly a high poverty rate that continues to exist, even though as the average GDP of the world continues to increase, because that GDP is an average number that they cite for every country. And so as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, on average, GDP looks pretty good, but actually the poor are not doing very well. Next. Now, our function as human beings need to think of what we want to do and how we're going to address this. And this is for us, for an institute for biodiversity and sustainability. We look at the vision of sustainable human and natural communities. And I think for most of the audience here, that's probably what you are also after, is to have sustainable human and natural community. The COVID-19 crisis, if you want, has really forced us to start thinking about sustainability and long-term, and why is it that we are not fulfilling the UNDP, UN Sustainable Development Goals? What is it that we are not doing right? So this is what we need to start talking about, and I hope that in the discussion we will open up a number of ideas about this. Next slide. Now, we in Palestine, of course, face huge dangers. One of the dangers is climate changing. We expect temperatures to continue to rise. It's already risen about 1.5 to 2 degrees in the past 2 or 3 decades, and we expect it to rise another 2 to 4 degrees centigrade in the next 3 decades or so. The rainfall will decline by between 20 to 25% in our region. Next. and you add to that, of course, the environmental impact of colonialism here. And I don't need to remind you, many of you are in Australia, New Zealand, other places near there. You are familiar with how colonialists sometimes impact the environment intentionally or unintentionally. I'm reminded of importing the wild hares or rabbits and then bringing the dingoes to try and control the rabbits, and the dingoes tasted the rabbits, found them okay, you know, but then they tasted the marsupials and found them taste better. So, so humans have breed to think that we can control our environment and we can manage it. Is really catching up with us, and COVID-19 actually reminds us of this very vividly, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the end. But for our case, of course, you know, Palestine was occupied, controlled, colonized for about 100 years now, and the early Zionist colonizers, they started some activities, but the later Zionist colonizers also did some activities that impact the environment. And for example, the settlements that are industrial settlements that are placed, dumping their toxic waste on us. And we did some studies on genotoxic effects of Israeli industrial settlements in Palestine and so on. Next slide. If you look at issues of water, for example, the water carrier that Israel created from Lake Tiberias to the western parts of the country, from what's called the Sea of Galilee, that diverted the water, have resulted in desertification of the Jordan Valley. And basically, Israel controls now most of the water resources of the Jordan Valley and other water resources. 91% of the water of the West Bank, for example, is controlled by the State of Israel and used for Israeli settlers. And again, you know, if you say, well, just like the GDP, as I explained earlier, if you look at total GDP, you say it's fine, you know, but you have to look at inequality of distribution. For example, of water, we Palestinians get less than what the World Health Organization recommends for healthy living, which is 100 liters per capita per day. And Jewish settlers and Israelis themselves get many folds, 8 or 9 folds more in terms of per capita water distribution. So they take our water basically, and we end up with minimal and even less.
Mazin, I think we may have lost you. Am I the only one who can't hear him?
No, I can't hear him either.
I'm not getting it.
Oh, you're back. Okay, good, Mazin. Go on. We lost you for a moment there.
I think we still have.
Or it looks as though Mazin might have frozen, although he's now, I think, back. Mazin, are you back? We lost you for a moment.
I was saying next slide, please.
1 second.
Okay. Yeah. Can you make it full screen or how do you? Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. As you know, this is a very nasty virus in terms of its spread. It's not nasty in terms of percentage kill in the population, as they say, but it's nasty in terms of infection rate is very high for it. And so it spread around the world in a fairly quick order, and certainly Palestine was not immune from it, and we got it in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip among the Palestinian population. Now, unfortunately, Europe considers Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip Israel doesn't even consider Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip because Israel doesn't recognize Palestine. East Jerusalem was annexed to Israel, as you know, illegally, and Israel doesn't allow Palestinians to count the population in East Jerusalem as Palestinian. So if you look at the numbers of cases, you know, for us, we count all Palestinians, so there are about 560 Palestinians who are infected with the COVID-19 in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There are a few hundred Palestinians in the Galilee and in other places, and then a few hundred Palestinians in diaspora who are infected. So we're talking total less than 2,000 Palestinians worldwide who have been infected. And this is a small number compared to, for example, if we look at France, Spain, Italy, the US certainly, which is now like over 1.3 million or something, and many people were killed. We had a few Palestinians who were killed. So you can say, well, Palestinians are very lucky. Well, yes and no. Lucky in the sense that the Palestinian Authority set up a very quick plan. This is an emergency plan that they instituted basically in early March and started proceeding with it once I discovered the first case. And they managed to control the virus. And I am a critic of the Palestinian Authority, as those of you who are on my email list know that that I don't, say nice things about the Palestinian Authority often. But in this case, in the case of the COVID-19 response, I consider it a fairly decent response. And but the reason I say you have to look at both, sides to this is, of course, Palestinians live under occupation and colonization. So the health services are already in a very, very bad shape, especially in a place like Gaza. And so how to respond in these places when you have such a devastating impact of the on the stresses on the healthcare. When people get sick, they need to go to the doctor. Doctors' cases here and medical services, like the whole of the West Bank, had very few ventilators. So of course they had to institute very drastic measures because they knew the healthcare services were not going to cope with it if they didn't do this. So at some level, one can understand the drastic measures they took. But the measures they took also have a devastating economic impact. Now, a devastating economic impact is around the world. But when you're talking about like Gaza, which had an unemployment rate already of 30–40%, which basically doubled when you have people staying at home, this is devastating, of course, to the economy of the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Next slide, please. Now, my background is medical genetics, and I say we have to look at the totality of the picture. We have to look at the patient history, make the right diagnosis, engage in proper therapy to give the patient the right prognosis. And this is to create the sustainable human and natural communities that I mentioned early on in the talk. I have just a few more slides and then I open it up for discussion. Next one. Here in Palestine, of course, our problems are far more compounded than, let's say, Australia or New Zealand or the US. We live in Bantustan's ghettos, and Donald Trump has the idea of entrenching this in a peace treaty, so to speak, or pacification treaty that would leave the Bantustans, the ghettos which we have, which are similar to South Africa, in place and actually strengthen the hold of Israel on this. The plan is to leave Palestinians on 8.3% of the historic land of Palestine, which is worse than in South Africa under apartheid, where blacks were relegated to 11.5% of the land. Next. And this continues to shrink year after year, but this is not unusual for world population, and colonialism, as you know, is a very common phenomenon in the world. In the US, for example, when the Europeans colonized the United States, 1492, the natives controlled the country, and by 1890, the natives were relegated to small areas, reservations, as they call them. Next. So here's where we need to start talking about solutions. If we recognize that this is a colonial, anti-colonial struggle, and that it's part of our global struggle to have sustainable communities, not just the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, we have to really think about how we do this, where we do it, what is our role as human beings, etc. I think, if we all agree that our goal is that we have sustainable human and natural communities, and that we would have less inequality, not more inequality, I think the answers become obvious as to our role. Our role is to challenge the systems of control and hegemony and greed that breeds billionaires who control our lives and who engage in wars. Actually, they don't engage in wars themselves. They pit us against each other. Christians versus Muslims versus Jews versus this versus that, so that they can maintain the benefit. They profit anyway, regardless of who gets killed. It's not their children who get killed. It's the children of poor people who get killed, who are the armies. Even if I think, for example, the Second World War, or even, the Second World War, many people think of it as a good war. I don't think there's good wars. I think there's always wars that benefit the rich and getting richer. And on both sides of elites are happy with the outcome of these wars. But if you think even in Australia, who served in the Second World War, it would be the children of the poor people and even Aborigines who joined the war, the children of the very rich billionaires. And Rupert Murdoch, certainly, his family did not sacrifice during wars. They got richer during wars. So I think that's what we have to think about. Next slide. In terms of the boycott, since you mentioned about boycott, divestment, sanctions, I encourage you to engage in it. It's basically us, the common people, methods of engaging at a level of nonviolent resistance to engage just like we did with South Africa, to pressure, especially on a moral level, to point out the disparity in structures of power. And I think that's why they are very important, and I encourage you.
We've lost Mazin's sound again, but we'll just hope that he comes back. Mazin, I'm not sure whether you can hear us. We'll just let his internet connection come back to normal. This is frozen. And now I think we've lost Mazin completely, haven't we? So look, I apologise, everyone. That's one of the problems in trying to do these talks online. Let's just give him a minute to reconnect.
Yeah, he'll reconnect. Yeah.
He'll reconnect, yeah. So to just ask for your patience. You might want to think about questions, because it looks as though we'll have a decent time for the question period, but let's just brief.
Can you guys hear me now? Sorry.
Yes,
I
yes,
don't
we
know when
can.
it got cut off. This is another hazard of the internet. I don't know if you heard the last two slides about boycott, divestment, sanctions.
We heard that, and then it was cut off.
Okay, then let's go to the next slide and try to wrap up. You know, we Palestinians have paid a heavy price for our resistance, over 100,000 killed, 800,000 injured, 900,000 detained and imprisoned. As I mentioned in the beginning, we're on the anniversary of the Nakba. My mother is 87 years old, by the way, 88 years old now. And she was a young girl when the Nakba came, and her best friend in school was from Deir Yassin, when they were about the same age at the time, 17 years old. They were both planning to be teachers, and actually they used to have teachers at very young age. So both my mother and this girl were teachers. And this girl went back to Deir Yassin. Her name is Hayab Al-Bisi, and she was killed with all her students in the school of Deir Yassin. Next slide, please. This is just showing me getting arrested a few times. Next slide.
That might be the end of it, Mazin.
That's it. Okay. So bottom line is we have had many challenges here in Palestine with climate change and with habitat destruction, environmental change, whether caused by Palestinians or Israelis as colonizers. We also have the challenge of colonization and the tragedy of colonization, which is supported by the Western countries, including, unfortunately, also the Australian government, which votes with the US and Israel against international law and to support the Israeli oppression of Palestinians. What do I want from all of you? I want you to work on these issues, not because I want you to help Palestinians. I think we are okay. I think this is joint struggle globally, where wars benefit a lot of people who are very rich already. And if we continue down this trend, we will go extinct as a species, either by climate change, global nuclear war, or by viruses, pandemics that could come up again with much more devastating impact. So I think we have a lot of challenges. Our challenges are uniform across the world.
Okay, Mazin, we've lost you again. We'll just wait again. Thanks everybody for your forbearance.
There's a couple of questions in the chat for you.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat which I'll take in order, but we will just wait for Mazin to come back. If people have questions, please do put them in the chat window, and I'm happy now is the time to start doing that. Mazin, you're back.
Okay, I'm done. I better be quiet, because every time I speak, I'm going to cause it to crash. So.
Well, I mean, look, if there's a problem with your connection, you could hide your image, you could stop your video, and that might be.
Yeah, let me stop the video,
okay.
And that will help with the connection. So.
Well, look, thank you very much for such a powerful and informative talk. We've got some questions which you can see for yourself in the chat window. Perhaps I'll just read them out so everyone can hear them, and we might take 3 at a time. And I'll just then get you, Mazin, to respond to them as a group, if that's okay with everybody. So the first question we've got is from Lubna Haikal, who says, what's the likelihood of you being arrested or detained as a result of this lecture? And that actually is the only question that we have from the audience at the moment. So maybe, Mazin, you might like to say something about that. Are you under any risk from having appeared for talking for us today. Okay, well, it looks as though turning off Mazin's video may not have helped. I did notice a question in the chat window about whether this PowerPoint slide could be made available, and we will certainly, with Mazin's permission, do that on the Facebook page of BDS Australia and also the Sydney staff for BDS group. It really looks as though Mazin is having connection problems. Yeah, you're back, Mazin. So let's try again. Are you under any danger or risk from having given this talk? That's the first question. The second question we have is, what did the coronavirus change in the attitude of Israeli authorities towards Palestinians? And the third question, if Israel does go ahead with formal annexation in July, what impacts do you think it will have on the daily lives of Palestinians in the occupied territories?
Yeah.
So please address those in whatever order you prefer.
In terms of, in terms of danger, the danger for me personally and for the people who work around me in the Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability is very minimal compared to people like in Gaza, for example, or people that are used to live, by the earnings of every day. So they are really hungry. I'm helping some people. We are helping some people. We have food baskets. We're doing some things. So for us, collectively, I would say, again, different people, different behaviors and what's going on. And what had changed since then is mostly the economic devastation that's associated with this. And of course, Israel doesn't like what we do as an institute, so they certainly try to make our life very difficult, even importing things like we need here for the museum, even books and stuff like that. We many times have to smuggle some things, etc., to get them to work. What was the second thing? Sorry about
the second question was how did the COVID-19 virus change the attitude of or what did the COVID-19 change in the attitude of Israeli authorities towards Palestinians? We've lost you again, Mazin. What did COVID-19 change in the attitude of Israeli authorities towards Palestinians? And I see that Lana has raised her hand. Lana, if you wouldn't mind putting your question in the chat window, please, if you have a question. Mazin has dropped out again. Again, apologies, everybody. Yeah, okay, Mazin, well, you're back. That's okay, it's not your fault.
I'm very sorry for this.
It's not your fault.
The Israeli state did not help medical access to Palestinians. For example, the blockade on Gaza is still operating even for medical supplies. People in Gaza are dying of common diseases that they could easily treat if they had access to medical supplies. What was the third question?
The third question was, if Israel does go ahead with formal annexation in July, what impacts do you think it will have on daily lives of Palestinians in the occupied territories?
Yeah, Israel has already annexed most of Palestine. 78% was annexed to and created as the State of Israel in 1948. And then part of Palestine and the Golan Heights were also annexed after 1967. Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, with an expanded border that includes many Palestinian villages, have been under Israeli control, and they even shut down operations of Palestinian clinics in East Jerusalem that were trying to control the COVID-19 events in Jerusalem. So already there is annexation that has happened and has impacted significantly Palestinian lives. They are talking about annexing Area C, some of it, and the Jordan Valley. And I don't know if they will do it or not. In July, there are Zionists who are saying this is not good for Israel because we need to keep the impression, as Ben-Gurion recommended, that we keep the impression that we want a two-state solution. But if they do it, it will certainly make life hell for the Palestinians that are in those areas, and it'll make hell for all of us, because I wouldn't be able to travel from one Palestinian area to another. The Bantustans will be isolated from each other.
Okay, thanks, Mazin. So next we have, I think, a question about your comparison of indigenous societies and colonialization. Do you want to just say a bit more about that, Mazin? So that's the first question. The second one is, when do Jewish settlers become Israeli? And the third one is using Bethlehem as a case study. Has it been necessary for many to stop work? Is the university closed? How are people coping? Has any government support helped people generally to cope with the tourists gone and so on? So those three questions. The first one.
I'm happy to ask my question about Indigenous society after Mazin answers the other two questions, because it's not exactly what I asked. Okay,
so Lana, okay, you can't put your question in the chat window, but we can have the first two questions first, then we'll go over to Lana. So the first question was, when do Jewish settlers become Israeli?
Well, Jewish settlers are Israelis. That's what, when the state of Israel was created, Zionist colonizers automatically became Israeli citizens as a new state of Israel in 1948. That's who they are. And any Jew in the world and any convert to Judaism is welcome to come to this country, get automatic citizenship, and come live on stolen Palestinian land anywhere throughout historic Palestine, and get more rights than the indigenous people who are mostly refugees. We Palestinians, 7.5 million of 13 million Palestinians are refugees or displaced people, and any Jew in the world can come here, get automatic citizenship, and become an Israeli citizen and live here in Bethlehem on land stolen from my relative.
Okay, we've clearly got another connection problem. We'll just wait again. Are you back with us yet, Mazin? Maybe I'll take advantage of the... Oh, you're back with us, Mazin. Okay, please. You briefly appeared and then we lost you.
Why did you do this?
Sorry, I just connected the hard wire. So hopefully maybe the Wi-Fi is not working very well. Maybe the hard wire will work.
Great, thank you.
But anyways, with regards to, so essentially all Jews in the world are allowed automatic citizenship, and they can come here and be considered Israelis and live on our stolen land, and refugees, simply because they are Christians or Muslims, are not allowed to go back to their homes and land. In terms of Bethlehem and the situation of Bethlehem, Bethlehem University is one of 12 Palestinian universities. It was closed at various times by the Israeli military. It has been closed now for a while because of the coronavirus. We are doing some student teaching remotely by internet, but many of our students are poor and don't have internet at home, or as you saw, the problem with the internet connections is not a very good scenario. We don't have the best internet connection. Israel controls all our airwaves, electromagnetic waves, the mobile phones, all the networks are not allowed to operate without Israeli permission, and they could shut us down anytime they want to. Now, if you want to ask the question about colonialism or rephrase it, I'm happy to answer it.
Lana, do you want to, if you wouldn't mind just trying to keep it as brief as possible?
It's just taking too long to type. Sorry, it's just taking too long to type. My question is, to say another world is possible, Rudolph, to say another world is possible, we need to see that a society with surplus can still be cooperative. So from Australia, Bruce Pascoe wrote a book called Dark Emu, showing that Aboriginal societies with huge surplus still lived cooperatively and communally. And I think that my question is that most people don't believe that an alternative to war and inequality is possible. And in order to fight for Palestine, it really is about, you know, the strategy about how to do that. And my view is that you've got the difference between South Africa, the South African campaigns, and today with Palestine is you're talking about, you know, the US and, you know, Egypt and Saudi Arabia being massive military powers compared to South Africa. You know, South Africa was not a massive military power. You know, the occupation of Palestine is a huge, you know, goal of world imperialism. So we're not just talking about divestments and boycotts. You know, we're talking about a whole system.
I got it.
Egypt and the US needing to, you know, be pushed, you know, as the way that Palestine, you know, an alternative society to Palestine is possible. I just wanted to make the comparison with Dark Emu and how Marx talked about primitive communism, where you can possibly have surplus and not have one clan take full control of that surplus and use militarization to keep control of that surplus, as is the case with capitalism.
Thanks,
I mean,
Lana.
I think, thank you. I think there's enough resources on this planet to feed everybody. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest problem we have is inequality, greed, human lust for power. That is fairly common and fairly uniform and resulted in what we call colonialism. Colonialism is just one manifestation of this greed and lust for resources and power that are really unneeded. I mean, the colonizers could live also comfortably in those countries if they allowed the native people to live comfortably in those countries. But they don't do that. Now, the situation, the similarities, of course, every country has unique features, but there are similarities and differences between us and South Africa, or between us and Australia or North America. But there are also differences and similarities, and you have to talk about them. And I wrote a lot extensively about this. I don't want to take too much of your time. But the diagnosis is still the same. If I say cancer, everybody knows what I'm talking about. And if I say colonialism, everybody knows what I'm talking about. Colonialism is a diagnosis that we have here, regardless of its peculiarities or uniqueness or whatever. And actually, the first organization that the colonizers set up to do this, they called it themselves Jewish Colonization Association. And they were not shy about using this terminology. Now, colonization has one of three possible outcomes. There's the Algerian model, where the colonizers pack their bags, go to Europe. I don't say back to Europe, because in the case of Algeria, the French were there 6, 7 generations. Many of them have never seen France in their lives even. That's one possible scenario. A second possible scenario is genocide of the natives, as happened in Australia and the United States, by the way. And the third scenario which is the most common scenario. Scenario 1 and 2 are rare scenarios. The third is the most common scenario, as happened in the rest of the world, whether it's in Africa, Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, all these countries, South America, all of South America, all of Central America, Canada, other countries. You know, one could argue even in other countries in Southeast Asia, like New Zealand, I don't know. But that scenario is where the natives and the descendants of the natives, descendants of the colonizers, live in one country and share that country and stop the issue of oppression and destruction of habitats and destruction of people's lives and so on. Now, I also want to just mention one sentence about the Aborigines living and having access. Palestinians also lived and had access as Canaanites. For thousands of years, we had access resources. We're one of the richest countries on earth. We're not a poor country. We're not a desert. This is part of the Fertile Crescent, actually, where humans first developed agriculture. When you eat wheat and barley and lentils and chickpeas, and you have goats and sheep, where did that happen? It happened first here in the Fertile Crescent before it spread to other countries in Europe and Asia. So I think we have access of resources. We don't have problem with resources. We do have problem with greed, as I mentioned, and that's why we have to push for that third scenario of coexistence, people living together. Sorry, my answer was a bit long.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Mazin. Can I just say we have two final questions, and can I just get you to answer them quite quickly, please, because we're almost out of time. The first is, what's your view of the one-state solution as proposed by the likes of Ilan Pape? And there's a second question on the idea of a single state. Do you see a way that this would be possible in a way that would not lock in apartheid further? So if you could just speak for about no more than 2 minutes, if you wouldn't mind, Mazin, please, so we can have time to wrap up.
I mean, I wrote a book called Sharing the Land of Canaan, which you can find it on my website. And also, by the way, people can email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat, which includes my website, which is qumsiyeh.org. If people want to email me at this email, and also that way I can add them to my email list if they would like to get more information or whatever. I send a weekly message to this. But on qumsiyeh.org, there's a book called Sharing the Land of Canaan. You can read it there. You don't have to buy it, which explains why there is no such thing as a two-state solution. The three scenarios I talked about earlier for colonial, anti-colonial struggles are the only scenarios available. You have to pick which scenario you want. There is no two-state, quote-unquote, solution to a colonial, anti-colonial struggle. So you have to pick one of those three scenarios, which one you prefer. And we Palestinians prefer that scenario of coexistence and living together. And we can live together. I mean, I have next to me, by the way, listening in on this conversation, Zohar. Zohar is an Israeli volunteer at the museum. She's volunteered with us several months, and she is living here now, basically. And so we have no problem coexisting, living together, whatever. So what's wrong with that? Why can't we live together?
Okay, thank you very much, Mazin. We're very grateful to you for having taken the time to speak to us this evening. And just to wrap up then, I will hand us back to Nadia from BDS Australia. Thanks, Nadia.
Okay, thanks for that, Mazin. That was wonderful. So just a reminder to everybody to go to our website to take the HP pledge, bdsaustralia.net.au. Also, you can make donations through the website as well. Okay, thanks everybody for being here.